Guys, it's me, Taisha. For my pop, I wanted to look at this idea of language, of academic language versus social language, and where do we find the happy medium in classrooms? So, my question that I kind of posed was: Is academic language the only language welcome in a classroom? How can we as educators create a safe space for all languages to thrive? There we go. So before we get into the presentation, we have to talk about acronyms. Acronyms, make up the world of education. So the first one we have is ELLs or ELLs, which is English language learners. The second one is SOC, which are students of color. Then the third one is ABE or BEV, which is African American Vernacular or Black English Vernacular. The next one is AE, which is American English. And then the last one is CRE, which is culturally responsive teaching. So before we can start, we kind of have to define what language is. And as we all know, language is a system of conventional spoken, manual, sign, or written symbols by which we as humans communicate. And then we take it one step further and we look at this idea of academic language. And academic language is the same thing as language, but it's one that we would typically use in a academic setting, be it written, oral, auditory, or visual. Those are all the things that we use while we're in an academic forum, such as the one we're in right now. Often I find my students don't know how to separate, the language they use at home or in those social settings with their friends versus the language we use in the academic world, which is our classroom. And to take it one step deeper, they don't see the reason why it should be separated. So for me, when I was doing this project, I said, do I want to figure out a way to educate my students on how and why we're supposed to separate social and academic language, or find a way to kind of merge the gap so we can make social language more accepted in the classroom? Because as we know, I teach high school students, so sometimes it's a losing battle to try to get them to completely shift the way they communicate. So maybe if I can meet them halfway, then I could be successful so they could be successful. All right. So when we look at academic language, to a lot of our ELs or L students and our students of color, this is what academic language can look like. And please note that when I say students of color, I don't mean all the students of color. I'm really focusing on the students of color who, one, live in poverty, two, who live in a household where their parents or guardians may be uneducated themselves or have a low level education. So they're accustomed to one way of communicating, and then they bring that into the classroom. So this, what I have down here at the bottom is French. It's a French transaction or translation, excuse me, of Romeo and Juliet, and it basically says, "Parting is such sweet sorrow." So imagine that you have a ninth grader and you write on the board, tell me what you think this means. And you literally just write, "Parting is such sweet sorrow." But to them, it looks like this because they don't understand it, right? They may know all these words separate by themselves, but to put it together and then to say, "Can you analyze this and tell me what it means?" may be foreign to them. So I think we often have to remind ourselves that what is easy to us is hard for an L or a student of color. So, doing so, we have to learn how to create a safe space for all of our students to thrive. Um, so, Mercury says that culture and language are inextricably mixed. Excuse me. Our students are comfortable in their own languages or dialects, and to ask them to step away from that is a daunting task. When we do this, we're separating and stripping them away from who they are and what they know. We must use culturally responsive teaching, CRE, in our classrooms to help our students thrive. When we merge both social language and academic language, it is one way we can continue to advocate for our students' language database. Once our students' proficiency level is determined, we can then help them develop both social and academic language by scaffolding the curriculum for them in our classroom. When we combine social language with academic language, we can help our students see the value there is to be able to know when to use academic language. So when we create when we create safe spaces for our students, we have to, of course, welcome all languages because all languages need to be respected. Um, from there, we need to create lessons that are centered around various dialects. There are many, many beautiful dialects out there in the world. So when we as teachers can create lessons that expose those dialects, then maybe our students who speak in a dialect that we don't typically use or speak in ourselves will see that it's okay to speak like this, and then they can feel more comfortable to one, make mistakes and be open to having their mistakes corrected. And moving into mistakes, we have to be mindful in how we make, we correct our students. We don't ever want to belittle or embarrass our students, especially in our classroom if we're doing open learning. We want to obviously correct them, but we just have to be mindful in how we do it. We don't ever want to make them feel like, no, they can't read aloud anymore. No, they can't answer a question, or no, they can't raise their hands. And then we have to listen to our students. We have to respect them when they come to us and say, hey, I'm struggling with this. I don't understand this. And then listen to them as they speak so we can pick up on the nuances of not only what they're saying, but how they're saying it, so we can help kind of gauge and guide them in making proper corrections. Come on, me and the screen class. There we go. So then we move on to this idea of intersectionality, which is the overlapping of social identities and the structure that creates a system of oppression. So in education, this concept recognizes that students can belong to more than one marginalized group. When we know our students' social identities and how and why they matter, we can group them in a way that is not solely by skill, which doesn't improve their achievement, but in a heterogeneous way. And when I did my research, this was the first time that I came across this word as it relates to the educational field, and I was really intrigued in it. And I wish I could have changed and did my whole research project on this, but I was like, no, we're not moving backwards. But it's really interesting when you look at it. Is I think of it as I think of it as leveling the playing field of academic language versus social language for my students. If I don't figure out how to level the playing field, I will lose the race before I start. If I'm only grouping my students based solely on, you know, they're standing in my classroom, like all the smart kids together and all the, low level kids together, all the strong English speakers together with all the, kind of struggling English speakers, then I will achieve nothing. So we have to figure out ways to group them so that all students are successful. No, we don't want to lay, the teaching responsibilities on the strong kid to help the kid who is struggling with not only language but the assignment on that student, because that's not their responsibility. But if we can find a way to kind of let them work together as a group so everybody advances, then that's kind of a beautiful thing. That's the goal we're going for. I also came across this notion of the in addition to mindset. When we're teachers, we have to think about this word in addition to. Yes, we have to teach the canon. Yes, we have to teach these important texts, but can we also teach something in addition to that? When we do that, we're looking at culturally relevant text that speaks to our students, text that our students see themselves mirrored in, text that students see, the wordage they use, the vernacular they use, the way they may communicate at home with their family. And often the canon doesn't necessarily bring that out. We find those more in modern day text. So if we can merge the canon with a modern day text that is relevant to our students, then we're kind of winning the race essentially. Reflection and representation matters. Students want to be able to reflect on a text and say that they saw themselves represented in said text. Again, we want them to feel comfortable by creating safe spaces. And when we find culturally relevant text, we can create safe spaces. I also came across things that Whitney said educators can do to help Ave speakers. And I would go one step further and say that you can also do this to help all of your students who struggle with language, and not necessarily just students of color. So we have to educate ourselves on the language and remember that it's not improper grammar and should be viewed with respect. Multiculturalism should always be incorporated into the classroom. Create a rich environment filled with various forms of oral language. Code switching should not be recognized, excuse me, code switching should be recognized and not shunned, and then provide students with a chance to write freely but in their language. And this is something that I haven't done before, and I will definitely do more of it moving forward. But to let students just openly write in their language outside of like a daily journal is important to them. It shows that one, this is a safe space, and two, that you respect their language and their dialect, and it's okay for them to use it. And then I'm gonna move up here to code switching. This code switching is important because everyone code switches, whether we recognize it or not. We all code switch. So I shouldn't shun my students when we're talking a group discussion and they use one dialect or one language, and then when they're in a small group session they may use another dialect or another language. I should never shun that. If I have two L students in my class who are speaking Spanish to each other, if we're not in a whole group session where I'm talking or leading the lesson, then I shouldn't shun that in any way, shape, or form. So what is the answer? There's no clear answer when it comes down to social language and academic language and how we can merge it in our classroom. We have to embrace our students' language and make space for it in our classroom. If we do not make space for it, we are not doing our job properly. We also have to check our privilege. I had an instance where, I was speaking to a teacher about something, and I said, well, I think it's because you have, the privilege of being white. And then when I got home, I reflected on it and I said, I too have to check my privilege. My privilege of academic language is something that I need to check. I'm aware that my student population is below grade level and does not often understand the nuances of the power of language. In that case, I cannot get upset when I discover they don't usually possess the knowledge to verbalize or write in the scope of an academic forum. Before I try to teach any scope of English, I must begin to build a foundation for the use of home languages and practice routines that bring those languages into the classroom. And finally, I must look for help. The art of teaching is definitely a village. We do not do this alone. I have to enlist the support of not only other teachers, but other students to help build language. So, again, we have to check our privilege. And then I leave with this last question. Can we group English speakers in with the same way we do our L's? So often L's will have a program they go to outside of the classroom that helps, guide them through the process of becoming more comfortable in the English language. Um, but why do we not do that for our students who are born here, who have grown up with the English language, but still struggle with it? It is very hard for us to teach our students or correct language issues in our time period, be it a 40-minute block or a 90-minute block. We do what we can, obviously, by all the things I just mentioned, but at the end of the day, sometimes we just don't have enough time. So should there be, or why is there not a space for students who struggle with language, and not just a speech therapist, but struggle with language, to go and get, additional support to help guide them and help build them up? Because if the idea is, if they're struggling with language in my English classroom, then they're probably struggling with language in the science classroom and in the math classroom and in the history classroom. So should they not have the same support as our L students? That's my question I pose. And then I thought I would cover a couple books that really do code switching well. Um, Anything by Amy Tan does code switching beautifully, and she talks about language and the language of her family. Obviously, Louise Edrich does it well. She's a Native American writer. So she talks about language, being a Native American woman, and how the struggles she went through with language, using it, when she was around her people, and then kind of in the quote unquote outside world. Obviously, we have Zora Neale Hurston, who is a beautiful writer and was shunned because The Eyes Were Watching God is written in the Black vernacular. And then Jasmine Ward is a modern day writer. She talks a lot about, the Creole language and language down in Louisiana and the Bayou, and how when they step out of those areas, such as Louisiana, New Orleans, and the Bayou, how they just feel like they're in a whole completely different world because the language is so vastly different. So that's kind of what I have for you guys today. So again, I leave on this note, and I think I made my slide wrong, but we're going to go for it anyway. Is academic language the only language welcome in the classroom? No, it should not be the only language welcome in the classroom. All languages should be embraced. I hope you guys learned something. This was definitely a journey for me. Still don't have the answer for it, but all I know is we should just embrace, embrace, embrace. Thank you.